It's very, very nice to be here. This has been a bit of a journey for us over the last 20-some years, and I'll get into that a little bit. But there are two gentlemen who aren't with us this afternoon, who are really very instrumental in what we did. One gentleman, his name is Carol Lucas. Carol was one of Art Lundahl's, CIA's first imagery interpreters, as well as photogrammetrists. Unfortunately, Carol died about 6 years ago. He was also at one time Deputy Director of National Photographic Interpretation Center. And when I first met Carol, he was the head of the Photogrammetry department at NPIC, CIA. The other gentleman is named Andrew Biosh, Dr. Biosh, retired Navy intelligence officer, captain, also one of the second generation of imagery analysts for the Navy when officers were doing that work. He was also instrumental in the things that we've done over the last 20-some years. As well, we also have two other gentlemen who are photogrammetrists, world-class photogrammetrists, who are currently with us, but in different parts of the world. Mr. Larry Dambro, as well as Dr. Dewey Hauk. And anyway, we're dedicating our little talk to them. All right? Well, first of all, thank you so much, as I mentioned earlier. This presentation, in a general sense, I hope will convey to all of you that other disciplines were involved in all of this, a multidisciplinary effort. And as I mentioned, in a general sense, I think using the tools that we have used for this effort can help historians, I guess, get a little bit better insight in what events transpired. And finally, this presentation will take you through a journey that's taken us about 23 years. And as I mentioned, it's by 6 men. And to determine whether or not a second Imperial Japanese Midget submarine successfully entered Pearl Harbor during the early morning hours of 7 December and whether it succeeded in attacking Battleship Row. This is certainly one of the famous photographs of Pearl Harbor, and obviously one of the iconic photographs of the Second World War. We can see that the battle line has been struck and Hickam is on fire. And this photograph is just a few minutes before Arizona died. It was taken by a Japanese aircraft after it's had its run. Now, as I said, it shows the effects of the attack. In the background, we can see Hickam on fire. We can see also that, oh good, that's right, this is it? Oh good. Dangerous with a laser. Yes. We can see right here the Ogalla and the Helena. The Ogalla is about to turn over. She's been struck. We can see smoke coming from the cruiser Helena. We can see the California, the torpedo she received. We can see the residual of the explosive plume together with the first inclinations of oil. The tanker Neosho was never touched. We can see here the Oklahoma beginning her roll. Here we have the USS Maryland. We have the West Virginia, Tennessee, Arizona, Vestal, and Nevada. And this is, as I mentioned a few minutes before, Arizona disintegrated. Now, all of this started in 1993. I had incredibly bad duty that I had to go out to the Joint Intelligence Center Pacific every 6 weeks for 2 weeks at a time for about a 5-year period to go and provide imagery intelligence support to JICPAC. And during one of my visits there was in early '93. I was coordinating with an Air Force tech sergeant who, his name is Mike Scheifler, a fantastic imagery analyst. And Michael was running the training department there as NCO. And Michael would go over to his buddies over at PACAF headquarters at the film library because his buddy would say, hey, look, we're ready to get rid of some imagery. Can you come on over, take a look, take what you can, and use it for your courses? Well, he had done that, and I'll show you an example of that later. But anyway, he went over to the Park Service and met with a gentleman named Dan Martinez, who is still, I believe, the historian of the Park Service there. And Dan had said, boy, we'd really like to have this whole thing mosaicked or whatever, and yes, I know someone who can help you. And so I met Dan Martinez mid-'93, or very early '93. And we were talking about this other project, and he said, oh, by the way, have you seen this photograph? I said, well, yeah, sure I have. He said, there's a gentleman named Burl Burlingame, who I believe is still a journalist out there with the newspaper. And Burl came out with a book in 1990 titled Advanced Force Pearl Harbor. And it deals with the Japanese submarine force, to include the midgets. And in the book, he postulates that this object right here might in fact be a midget type A Japanese submarine. And, excuse me, Dan asked me, he said, do you think you could prove it, or not prove it, but substantiate his claim, or deny it, or whatever? Can you get to the bottom of it? And I think we can, I said. So Dan basically said, well, can you prove or disprove, or can you corroborate with what Mr. Burlingame said? And oh, by the way, we'd really like to know a little bit about more of this photograph. Can you tell us the time it was taken? Give us an indication of that? I said, well, we could do our best. So that's how this journey started. We received a, oh, by the way, this photograph came via the U.S. Naval Attaché in Madrid, Spain. See, after the attack, this photograph was widely disseminated by the Japanese to show the success of their battle, at least this photograph. And it was our Naval Attaché in Madrid that had a copy of the photograph and brought it over to Office of Naval Intelligence. So that's the genesis of this photograph. So what we used, without getting too technical, was that we used a Duke negative, which was about a 10% reduction from the original image, which we digitized to begin this work. Now I'm showing this. This is an artistic rendition by my dear friend Peter, showing two of the Type 5A submarines entering Pearl Harbor. And I'm showing this to emphasize the planning of the attack, and I'm sure you heard that from Dr. Zim earlier, was certainly a combined arms operation. And most Americans don't realize that, I'm sure. I'm sure you can elaborate on all of that. But this was a combined arms operation that involved submarines besides the attack aircraft. And we're not just talking about the 5 midget submarines, but we're also talking about 14 fleet submarines that were going to be used. According to Captain Arito, who wrote the book I-Boat Captain, for the submarine force, Yamamoto's plan was to involve the 14 fleet submarines that would take up positions to the north of Oahu, ringed roughly in 3 concentric arcs. He also wrote in their mission was to screen for Admiral Nagumo's Kaido Butai, to warn him of the presence of U.S. warships and or merchant shipping in the general area. And with the attack, they would also be in a position to rescue down flyers as well as intercept U.S. warships exiting from Pearl Harbor. And additionally, there were the 5 fleet submarines carrying these Type A midget submarines. Now, this is a plan showing the operational position of the mother submarines. Up here is the timeline. We were asked to create a timeline from the standpoint of when these were released and projecting how far they could go during the time of the projected release. The submarine in question is this one right here. She was launched, here's the entrance of Pearl Harbor. She was launched at 042 at 212 degrees, 7 nautical miles from the buoy at the entrance of Pearl Harbor. Followed by the others, I-22 Tau, and we'll get into that later. I-18 Tau, she was the furthest one out. You could see she was at 12 miles, a little over 12 miles. I-20 and I-24. These submarines were directed to enter Pearl Harbor, tactically to attack, either during the attack itself, the aerial attack, or to attack at their discretion. To withdraw from the harbor and rendezvous with their mother submarines off Lanai. This was not a suicide mission. We were asked to create a timeline. We incorporated U.S. Navy operations as well as the Japanese. What we did was, this is the initial study of 93-94. Up here we projected a speed overall of 4 knots and 5 knots and 4 knots for each one to get to the buoy, to the entrance of Pearl Harbor. Okay, not inside. We also have operations here. We had minesweepers Condor and Crossbill departed Pearl Harbor at 0200 and continued operating until 0525. We had a U.S. Navy auxiliary, Antares, that had come from one of the other islands, and she approached and entered Pearl Harbor, the buoy, at around 06. And of course, we had the USS Ward, the destroyer that had been out on the patrol in the exclusion zone that night. You can see that she had been operating all the way through. This is the period in which she made contact with the third submarine that was released, I-18 Tau, and sank her. And the submarine nets, we know they were opened before the Crossbill and Condor, but through here and through 04458, they were opened. We don't exactly have timelines on that, but it's assumed, considering what was going on here, the nets probably were open. But it didn't matter for them, because the boats were designed to go under the nets and through the nets. For perspective, the first image of the harbor is a recent satellite photograph. And the second composite, this is the one that we were asked to do. Very quickly, as I mentioned, good tech sergeant actually found a roll of 9x9 negative. And it was a dupe negative, a dupe neg, of beautiful fidelity. And as he rolled it out, he noticed that it was all hand stenciled, and it said 26 November 1941. There was an Army Air Corps aerial mapping survey of Pearl Harbor shot in stereo. I want to tell you something. We would always want to do this, but could you imagine today taking that stereo and doing a Google Earth, and you could literally fly through Pearl Harbor 10 days before the attack? That's the potential this thing has. So we were asked to produce this mosaic, but I'm using this as an example. As you can see, this was taken 10 days before the attack. The Great Enterprise is here, Northampton, the battleships. In fact, the Arizona was in dry dock at the time. And here you can just see the bow of the Lexington. This is a day or two before those two carriers left to take their aircraft out to Midway and to thank you. Begins with a W. Thanks. It is really, there were 3 distinctive flight lines with a 25% overlap between flight lines and 70% overlap between frames. Oops. This is a graphic that came from Captain Orita's book, I-Boat Commander. Now, the track, as the Midget sub-commanders, or they were called pilots, were directed to do, to enter Pearl Harbor and to maintain Ford Island on their port side. As you can see by the times involved, whoops, sorry, pilot error. Here are the waypoints: 0450, 0500, 0510, 515, 520, 525, and out the door at 0530. Well, I don't know necessarily out the door, but the fact is that this was their operational plot, if you would, to circumnavigate. Now, taking up their tactical positions, I'm not aware of, except we do know that, as I showed just earlier, here's the old meatball, I-22 tow, which we all know had fired 2 torpedoes. One blew up at Pearl City, and the other one also was directed at one of our ships and missed. She was, in turn, rammed and sunk by the destroyer Monaghan. So, postulating, obviously, he went around the island, and maybe that was his tactical position. Don't know, but that's where he was caught. And this was part of the original map that was taken from the beached submarine up the North Shore. This is another one of Peter's beautiful pieces of work. Oh, by the way, Peter does all the commissioning paintings for our ships, our warships when they're commissioned, as well as christening. So, in fact, you're going to be off to What's the next one? The Tulsa, the USS Tulsa, and the LCS. Well, as his rendition shows, upon arriving inside Pearl Harbor, each submarine was to lie on the bottom, and then, having the tactical discretion, they would either tack during the main aerial attack or wait until after. Now, this was the initial study done by the four of us, Carol Lucas, Andrew Biosh, myself, and the two photogrammetrists. And our results, MPS, National Park Service, asked, is it a sub? And we conducted two interrelated analyses. One was imagery intelligence, looking for observables that would either lend themselves or discount the fact that that object was a submarine. And then establishing a timeline. And the second step was the photogrammetric effort, in which conduct critical measurements of the object, place it within a geographic location, and to determine the object's dimensions. Now, from an observable perspective, here's the object. It has a length and it has height. It has a vertical and a horizontal dimension. Here are three distinctive rooster tails in various stages of with the most recent one closest to the object. We have splash points. There are two of them, but there are others. There's wave propagation. This is the result of the torpedoes exploding against West Virginia and the Oklahoma. In the scene is a 50-foot utility boat from one of the ships. Gives us someone a little bit of perspective, a relationship from the standpoint of the utility boat and that object. There are torpedo tracks. And our dear friend Carol Lucas goes, you know, John and company and Andy, there are two more torpedo tracks in the water than there are splash points from the torpedoes dropped from the aerial aircraft. And oh, by the way, one appears to be going to the Oklahoma, and the other one is right here on the West Virginia. And backing them out, their point of origin, whoops, and here's the plume. There's a plume of water rising between the mastheads. That's an explosion from a torpedo on the West Virginia. And let's see. And the question, what is that, a splash point? Well, not really, but that's something to talk about later. Here, those two tracks come right about here. And yes, there is an aircraft. There is an aircraft in the scene. But the aircraft's relative position indicated to us that the aircraft approached right to left in the screen on the field of view of the image. The attacking aircraft here against Battleship Row coming from the East Loch were moving this way. Here's that mosaic I told you about. This is what we did. You saw that satellite photograph, the color. At the time, we had a USGS quad chart, 125,000 scale. And the job was to take common points that are on the chart as well as on the photograph, tie them together photogrammetrically, and anchor the photograph in space, namely with latitude and longitude. Okay? That's what was done. Then with that attack photograph, a photogrammetrist basically, and it's beyond, I'm just a history political science major, took the photograph and basically triangulated it down onto the position. And the result was, here's the approximate latitude and longitude of the object there. And within a CEP, circular error probable, of 100 yards. That's 100 yards in diameter. Okay? So in that point, 100 yards in diameter, that object was located. Now, I only reference the fact that here are the mooring saddles for, at the time of the attack, the Maryland, the Oklahoma, Tennessee, and West Virginia. I'm putting this in because my wife and I were out in Hawaii not last month, October. The Naval Board of the United States had its annual Congress there, and we went to the museum there. And I looked at it, I went, wow, look at that field of view, that is incredible. Just for perspective, although the periscope would have been a little bit lower, that little object could have had that kind of field of view. Now, the photogrammetrists, as I mentioned, looked at a vertical object and a horizontal object, and they measured the following. The height of that vertical object was 3.9 feet. Now there's an error. Not much though. The length that you can see here to here was 59.7 feet. Here's the actual dimensions. It's a little less. It's 79 point some feet and some inches. Length overall to the props. And the height of the sail, 5 feet 8 inches. Fairly close. And of course, the horizontal feature, you have that wave action caused by the exploding torpedoes. Whoops, sorry. Pilot error. Here's that wave. Now, these submarines, the way they were designed, and believe me, this was a strategic surprise to us. I mean, these are what workmanship. And to me, it's a combination of simplicity and sophistication. It's like a yin and yang. Now, these torpedo tubes were open. And once a torpedo was fired, the boat would lose ballast. To regain trim, the empty tube would flood. That was by design. So as you can imagine, it would do this. And I was going to say, Professor Tim, you've been a nuker, right? Oh, well, what happened to him? I thought he was going to be here. Well, who's been on a nuclear fast attack? And you've been in the Pacific, and you're on the surface. You know what they do? Rooster tails showed up from their props. So, and as well, we were told by a surviving gentleman who served on those boats. He said, yes, every time you fired a torpedo, we would lose our trim, and our stern would rise, and we'd create these rooster tails. Okay? So that's the information that we had at the point in time. Now, this submarine was incredibly sophisticated. It had a dash speed of almost 20 knots. Look at the hull form. It had a range of 100 nautical miles at 4 knots, a dash speed of 20 knots. These were designed as ship killers. They had two 21-inch torpedoes, and they had a single shaft with counter-rotating propellers. Now, Peter helped us when he came aboard. Can you notice these plumes? We have been told that they were explosive ammunition, blowing up in the water. Well, I don't know about you, but that doesn't exactly look like exploding ordnance. If you notice, there are two distinctive tones. There's an outer and a darker inner, corresponding to counter-rotating torpedoes. And I know Peter will speak more at that at length. And here's the frequency between, they coincide exactly with the waves that washed across the submarine. We presented our findings on December 7th, 1994 to the Park Service during the commemoration ceremonies. And our team at the time said, yes, we've got an operational timeline for you. We conducted critical measurements on the object as well as trying to determine its location. These rooster tails, they're not ordnance. The wave propagation, it seemed to us those waves helped bring that submarine up. because she still was not in trim. Apparently she had just fired her second torpedo. There are more torpedo tracks in the water than aerial splash points. Based on what we have seen, we are extremely confident that it is in fact a Type A submarine. And in fact, it would have been the unknown one, the first one that was released. If you saw that timeline at 0051, the submarine in question was released from her mothership and only a few miles offshore. She had plenty of time to get in, plus over the fact that the nets were most likely wide open for her, because the second boat released was the one that was sunk by the Monaghan. The third one was sunk by the Ward. The fourth one was sunk and wasn't found, and we'll show that later, until 1960. And the fifth one released had gyro problems. In fact, they lost trim. They almost went down, thousands of feet of water. They were able to get the trim, but this guy was definitely lost. He wound up going around the island and beached up on the north, not the north, New York Highway. And he became the first prisoner of war. The enlisted guy died. I don't know what happened there. But, So anyway, in 1998, at our office, a gentleman named Peter Sue knocked on his door, our door. And Peter, and I'll embarrass him because I like to do that. That's what a good friend is for. Peter apologized to us immediately for not, he said, I was aware of your work. It is really very, very good. But I think I can help out some more. And he apologized for not being with us because he just finished doing analysis on the Titanic, how she sank on the Lusitania, as well as he buttressed the initial findings that the main blew up internal explosion and not by a mine. So Peter came to us and said I could do some work on those rooster tails and weapons effects. Peter is quite an interesting gentleman. He is a Renaissance man, to say the least. He helped develop algorithms dealing with the effects of underwater shock on ships, which, as a result of the 1991 War, we had the Tripoli, and what's her name, the cruiser, hit by mines. So he's in developing that kind of stuff. Plus, he's an expert in metallurgy and overall forensic analysis of the effects of weapons. Now, Peter, you can start on this, and what we're going to do, I've got a link to a YouTube. How many of you saw the documentary Killer Submarines of Pearl Harbor that came out, the Nova Special? Okay, you did? You don't count, Judy. I'm sorry, she does, but my wife. Did you see it too? Anyway, what I'm going to do, James, is get to that link. And Peter, if you want it, please start as I get this thing set up.
It's fuzzy and unclear, but some experts believe it's a Midget sub firing a torpedo straight into battleship Road.
Can you see the utility boat?
This point was roughly 1,600 feet. We have numerous torpedo tracks in the water. In fact, Naval Intelligence Officer John Rodgaard and forensic engineer Peter Sue spent years analyzing this photograph.
What we see in this photo is the effects of the initial aerial torpedo strikes against battleship Road. You can see the concussion waves radiating out from the ships that have been hit. We can see torpedo tracks in the water. We see an object in the water with a distinctive horizontal feature and a distinctive vertical feature.
Both are features of a Midget submarine.
The vertical feature would be the sail. The horizontal feature, the hull. We can see behind plumes of water caused by a propeller.
Could those plumes of water be caused by a torpedo being dropped by an airplane?
No, because the torpedo hitting the water has a distinctive splash. It's a forward movement. This does not have that characteristic. It's more of a fountain effect caused by a propeller.
The propeller, Midget sub number 5. Whenever a Japanese Midget sub fires a torpedo, there's a sudden loss of balance.
A torpedo weighs about 1 ton. The sub weighs 46 tons. When a torpedo is launched, the forward part suddenly gets 1 ton lighter.
which in turn rocks the sub up and down as the crew struggle to regain control. This creates a unique plume of water called a rooster tail, which occurs when the propeller flies out of the water. But did the torpedo hit its target? The rooster tails in the photograph could offer a clue.
It generates a surface disturbance.
According to Sue, an expert in fluid dynamics, one of these rooster tails may also be the result of the Midget sub-torpedo hitting its mark. The team's original classified calculations have been re-engineered into a revealing animation. When a torpedo blasts into a ship, it produces a shockwave powerful enough to lift a sub out of the sea. The shockwave created by an airborne torpedo is not powerful enough to reach the launcher sub.
The area generated by the shockwave does not reach the submarine.
Because a torpedo fired by a Midget sub has a warhead almost twice the size of one dropped by an aircraft, the shockwave it creates radiates much further. And when that torpedo hits its target,
The rotation extends beyond the submarine and lifts it above the surface.
but how does the animation compare with the original photograph?
What we see in the animation is the effect of the explosion on both the submarine and the large rooster tail. As we can see as a snapshot in time of a large plume behind the submarine in the photograph and the plume rising alongside the West Virginia. The correlation is perfect.
The West Virginia took at least 7 torpedo direct hits.
Okay. The movie explains the critical part of this diagram is the center of the explosion. Now, when a charge gets set off at the inside the water, below water line, it's a chemical reaction, and underwater explosion is basically a chemical reaction on the charge. When it explodes, it expands the bubble and then collapses. And with that, it generates a surface disturbance in three stages. The first stage that you will see is on the surface, a spray dome. And after that, you have the first plume, and then the final stage would be the big plume that you see up as the geysers and water. Now, at the photograph that we saw, right at the first stage, which means that the detonation just started and the bubble expanded out. Right. As a result of that, the shock front, the reflective ray would generate a area which you call cavitation, bulk cavitation zone. I hope I'm not using terms that you guys don't understand. It's a vacuum type like response inside the fluid that subsequently would have a vertical cake velocity to push objects up on the surface. When the torpedo hit, the shock wave generated would pass the submarine, and also generated the bulk cavitation at the same moment after the wave passes. And for that effect, it launches the submarine in a vertical motion. That's when it explodes the stern of the submarine. Now, on a counter-rotating propeller, basically it's 2 sets of blades that would grab the water from the front disc, pass it on, and the rear set would pick it up and push. The effect would be a very straight vector of fluid pushing in the back, so to propel the ship or the torpedo or the submarine. And when you lift it out of the water, they will just concentrate and split and just flow waters up. So when the submarine expose its tail, the rotating propellers, it would generate the spray up, which is the largest one. That's the effect of the animation that you just saw. The animation was done up in New York and with some associates from Weilinger, and they were the one that put the picture together, and I was the one that calculated the effects, not taking the bottom refraction on the envelope of the bowl cavitations. This is the first stage of the explosion. I'm sorry, the first plume of the explosive effect. You don't see very well the spray dome because there are oils all around. But after this happened, the water would burst up in a much higher elevation.
I was going to say, I'm sure you've seen some other photographs showing these huge water plumes. That's that third stage of a torpedo striking, exploding.
So the timeline from this point on, calculate the position of the spray, the expansion of the bubble, and its collapse time. You can generate the envelope of the bowl cavitation, and they all match out in terms of timeline. And also, now these are measured in milliseconds. The travel, the shock wave from the explosive effect reaches submarine in about 300 milliseconds, which is about what, 0.3?
0.3 seconds. 0.13 seconds, right? With Peter's work, we submitted our findings to Naval Institute History, and the article was run in 1999, and we received the Historian of the Year for that. In 2001, we were asked to do work on motion picture photography, surviving motion picture photography that shows how the Arizona blew up. And you might have seen the documentary called The Death of the Arizona. Stockard Channing did the narration. That was pretty cool. Okay. Anyway, from that point, we continued on. We were asked by the same producer of the series to work on a part of a Pearl Harbor special in 2003 called part of the Unsolved History series. And then what was a surprise to us is we went out to California, and Mr. Eric Nelson, who was at that time the president of the company Termite, they did all the specials for this Unsolved History series. They had, unbeknownst to us, and I think that was a reason for it, constructed a 2/3 model of a Type A submarine, placed it in a lake, and then created these waves to see what would happen. Notice anything familiar? So, after 2000, we received from the Japanese Defense Force the official documents of Pearl Harbor, and we ran across these two signals that were sent. At 22:41 local time, I-16 received a message from her baby saying, "I succeeded in sneak attack." At 0051 December, basically 24 hours after she had left, her mother, she sent a message, "Impossible to navigate." So there were two radio transmissions from the Midget to her mother. She was to get out of Pearl Harbor and to rendezvous with the mother submarine along with others, if they survived, off of Lanai. Now, what we knew by 2004, the second submarine that was released, I-22 Tau, was sunk by the Monaghan and subsequently raised and dumped into a building site. The fifth submarine released was the one that had the navigation problems, almost never got off the deck, basically, if you want to call it that, and wound up beaching on the North Shore, and is now a museum piece down in Texas, right? what used to be the Admiral Nimitz Museum. The officer survived, became the first prisoner of war, and the enlisted men drowned. That's her there, December 7th. In 1960, when there was work extending the runway to the International Airport, that huge runway, guess what they found? That's a U.S. Navy salvage ship. Now, I want you to be of interest about what they did here. See what they did? See how they brought her out of the water? And oh, by the way, she had her 2 torpedoes. She was hit and sunk during the action. Our EOD people took the front end off. This submarine was built in 3 sections, all right? And riveted together. Beautifully fine machinery, okay, to put them together. Beautifully done. They took the bow off, blew the bow up, and gave the after 2/3 back to Ichijima, which is the Japanese Maritime Self-Defense Force Academy, Naval Academy. And they put a new front end on it. And you saw the Japanese commander. That's that boat. So, what's going on here? Well, Pearl, Hawaii University Research Lab, found it. Well, I'm sorry. This is the 4th one. I'm sorry, I'm getting ahead of myself. 2000 and they found I-18 tow with a shell hole through the sail. This was the submarine sunk by the war, and she's in about 1,000 feet of water. They found her. And notice, whoops, my fault. Their torpedoes are still there. Now, it's interesting, these boats, and I'll get into it real quickly, these boats were the first of their type, and subsequent boats didn't have fittings such as this. The figure 8 torpedo guard. All succeeding boats did not have that. That is #1 standout characteristic, and there were only 5 boats built that had it. So the question is, where the heck is I-16 tow? Well, unbeknownst to us, and leading up to this special killer submarines of Pearl Harbor, Pearl found it. And they found it in 3 pieces. They found it in a debris field. And around the debris field were wrecked, blown up LVTs, amphibious assault vehicles, and other debris. On May 21st, 1944, in the West Loch, in preparation for Operation Forager, which was the invasion of Guam and Saipan, a terrible, horrendous accident occurred, which was kept secret for well over a decade. There was a mishandling of ammunition, which disintegrated 3 LSTs, and fires raged and raged. Almost 200 sailors were killed and longshoremen. Hundreds others were wounded. Debris all over the place, and you can imagine now, think about the operational requirement, get Operation Forager on time. What were they going to do? Dredge the entire loch and get rid of the debris. Get rid of all the obstructions. Here's a photograph showing some of the destruction. Now, as part of the Nova television series, the show, the killer submarine Pearl Harbor, the Midget submarine partially was recovered after the disaster was pulled up. The wreck was dumped offshore in 3 pieces. Photographic evidence of the wreck shows that. There are 3 distinctive pieces. There is a small piece just after the main section that is missing. But the after piece, which was the motor and drive shaft, is beautifully intact. The forward section, where the torpedo tubes are and the torpedoes, beautifully intact. The centerpiece from the forward edge past the sail is intact, except you saw this ragged. However, based on our understanding of what we've seen, the correlation of the fact that the show went on to say that there was a detonation charge that went up, and that the Japanese crewmen blew their submarine up in the West Loch and died subsequently for it. But the photographic evidence that we have seen does not correlate with that assessment. I know, Peter, you can jump in any time. Remember that photograph I showed earlier? See how that submarine was brought up? We're thinking that that's how that one was brought up. Now, this submarine was not from a trim perspective. Her torpedoes are missing. So we are thinking that right here is where the jagged edges are. This after section is nearby, wrapped around with rope. The bow is there, separate, wrapped around with rope. And the pieces, and oh, by the way, this part here is in perfect shape, and we'll show this in a second. There is the after end of that sail, of this middle section. And here you saw, from that perspective, this jagged edge. Here is part of her hull, laid out like this. Peter, do you want, please?
Yeah, I do like to add on here. This is some of the lessons learned that I got from doing the Titanic and also the USS Maine. When people look at a detonation below the underwater detonations, you have the bubble expanded, and also you have the water coming back to fill the pocket. Right? That effect tend to bend any object that was expanded out, so you cannot have a smooth cylinder. In this case, will be the submarine hull. They have just broken pieces. It's not representation of a underwater explosion damage. And on the other hand, not on the other hand, on the other effect was that if you drop an object down from the surface, you have also the entrained water pocket inside the cylinder or the ship. When they hit the bottom, the water also scatter out. That's why the Titanic part of the stern is all like a pancake, because the entrained water come down like a big hammer and smash you on it. So if you have an explosion, in this case on the Pearl Harbor one, the harbor is about 40, 50 feet. Right. So at maximum, you would just have not even two expansion of the bubble, probably just one. So when it expands out, the water would retract into the bubble. Right. That,
Next one.
no, the wrong one.
Oh, here.
Right.
That's the after end.
That's the after end.
You can see the motor.
And it's circular. The bolts are just sheared off, and literally there's no damage on it. It's not consistent with any underwater effect or explosion, because the charge is about 300 pounds of dynamite. That's a lot of force.
And if I may, that after end, the others have postulated that the scuttling charge, detonation charge, was in the center section. If that was the case, well, by the way, it wasn't, because all the boats had their detonation charge in the forward section of it. Okay. This is the submarine cooked up at Pearl Harbor. Note how the skin is peeled outward like a flower. Here. In 1942, a different variant of the same Type A attacked Sydney Harbor and was sunk. Note how it blows out. And oh, by the way, this is the piece that we saw with the other submarine, with the jagged area. The detonation charge was forward, and it's open like a rose petal, like a rose. That would have happened to the center section and the back end of our submarine if in fact the charge was set aft. But why would a 300-pound charge aft when you have to compensate for the lack of buoyancy when you fire two torpedoes? So, the results of our analysis after 23 years of mucking around with this. Bottom. We don't consider it a war grave. Now, we have no idea what happened to those guys. The multidiscipline techniques used to help understand, greater understanding of historic events. And that's what I hope you take away from you, is the efforts of these other disciplines to help historians. Sir? 2. Sir? Well, we've seen the battle damage photographs of the West Virginia. It's nigh impossible because she was absolutely ripped, with those torpedoes that came and hit her. Although, and Peter and I have talked about this, we feel that the time, you see how she was settling, she was already had a significant list of port. That torpedo could have hit above the armor belt. We don't know. But she had already been struck with many torpedoes. And thankfully, her watertight doors were closed, and they were able to counterflood, and she sat even on her bottom. Oklahoma not. Sir? Right. Right. Yeah, it's in Burl Burlingame's book. Yes, when the Phoenix did sortie out. Yes. Can't answer it. Now, those mothers were supposed to go to Lanai. I don't know about you, but I would have been a very aggressive submarine captain waiting for somebody to come out. Now, before I'd rendezvous. Don't know. Can't answer it.
I'd like to supplement your questions on about the torpedo. The cake fly in at an ideal speed about 160 knots. So by the release of the torpedo, it would probably pick up to 180. And you have to drop the torpedo at about 100 feet off the water so that it will not, with the fin, will not hit the bottom. So the angle of entry is roughly between 10 and 20 degrees. And the Japanese are very, very smart to design that fin in the back. So when they come in, drop, and the tail will just pick up. So the torpedo won't dive in, you just settle. And it probably reach down to about close to bottom, hitting the sill, and then come up. And the bubble will rise about a foot a second. So when you see those bubbles, the trails, actually what you're seeing is that the torpedoes underneath the bubble trajectory. Now there are people who are saying that those may be airdrop torpedoes. Am I taking away the time?
Well, we'll have to cut off soon.
All right.
Go off.
Now when the plane comes in, you can. It's a simple physics calculations, right? When you drop the torpedo, and you can calculate the time, distance, and all. And that picture, this picture, you would have seen the plane in the photograph.
Yeah, but if it had been an arrow, you would have seen the arrow.
You have seen it. It's a simple calculation, free falling body. Right?